I counted the seconds between the clicks of my kitchen clock this morning, not because I needed to know the time, but because the sound had become the loudest thing in the room. When a clock becomes louder than your thoughts, you begin to understand something about silence that no one ever explains to you when you're young. Silence is not quiet. It has weight. It presses against your chest and settles into the corners of your home like dust you can't quite reach. I'm Arthur. I'm 87 years old, and for a long time, I believed that happiness required other people. I believed it the way you believe in gravity, as something fixed and unquestionable. And when the people went away, as they tend to do, I assumed happiness had gone with them. My wife Eleanor died on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, the kind of day that feels like a beginning, which made it a particularly cruel time for an ending. For weeks after, I kept the windows closed because I was afraid the fresh air would carry her scent away. Grief does strange things like that. It turns ordinary decisions into sacred rituals. The chair she used by the window remained untouched. Her teacup stayed where she left it, a faint ring at the bottom, marking the last time she drank from it. I wasn't preserving objects. I was preserving evidence that my life had once been shared. People came, of course. They always do at first. My daughter visited twice a week, then once, then when she could manage it between her own responsibilities. My son called from another state, his voice warm but distant, like sunlight through a window you can't open. Friends stopped by with casseroles and careful expressions. They said things like, "You're strong," and she wouldn't want you to be sad, as if sadness were a choice I could set aside like an old coat. And then slowly, gently, almost politely, they returned to their own lives. No one tells you that loneliness doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in. It replaces things gradually. A missed phone call becomes two. A quiet afternoon becomes a quiet week. The house doesn't feel empty at first. It feels paused, as if life has stepped out for a moment and will return shortly. But it doesn't return. And one day, you realize you've been waiting in a room where nothing is coming back. I tried to fight it the way people suggested. I attended a local seniors group that met in a community hall with bright lights and folding chairs arranged in circles that encouraged conversation I didn't know how to start. A cheerful man named Dennis tried to involve me in card games. A woman offered me homemade cookies and asked where I was from, as if I hadn't lived in the same town for 52 years. I nodded, smiled, participated in the smallest ways I could manage, and went home feeling more invisible than before. Being surrounded by strangers who are also lonely doesn't always make you feel less alone. Sometimes it sharpens the feeling, like turning up the volume on something you were trying not to hear. Then I tried filling the silence. Television ran from morning to night, not because I was interested in the programs, but because voices, even artificial ones, felt like a substitute for presence. I would fall asleep in my chair with the screen flickering against the walls, wake in the middle of the night, and sit there disoriented, unsure whether I had been resting or simply passing time. One evening, I caught my reflection in the darkened television screen. I looked like a man waiting for something, and the uncomfortable truth was, I didn't know what I was waiting for. A visit? A call? A return to a life that no longer existed? Waiting had become my routine, my quiet occupation. It filled my days without giving them meaning. That realization did not arrive like a revelation. It came quietly, almost reluctantly. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a plate I hadn't used, and I thought, if nothing changes, this will be the rest of my life. Not dramatically worse, not dramatically better, just this steady, colorless stretch of days. There is a particular kind of fear that comes with that thought. Not fear of danger, but fear of sameness, of becoming so accustomed to emptiness that you stop noticing it altogether. I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I was afraid of disappearing inside it. So I made a decision that felt small at the time, insignificant even. I decided the next morning I would do one thing differently, not something large or ambitious, just one thing that required effort. I didn't know it then, but that decision would become the first step toward something I had misunderstood for most of my life. Happiness, I would eventually learn, is not something that arrives when loneliness leaves. It's something that can exist alongside it, quietly, stubbornly, like a plant growing through a crack in the pavement. But I wasn't there yet. At that moment, I was simply an old man in a quiet kitchen, holding a plate, trying to decide whether my life was still something I could shape, or something that had already settled into its final form. And the truth is, I didn't feel hopeful. I felt tired. Tired of waiting, tired of silence, tired of days that asked nothing of me and gave nothing in return. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes from doing too little for too long, and it weighs more than any labor I've ever known. The next morning, I woke up at the same time I always did. The clock ticked. The house creaked. Nothing had changed. But I remembered the decision I had made, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I chose to honor it. I got dressed. Not in the soft worn clothes I had been living in, but in something proper. A buttoned shirt, trousers that required a belt, shoes I had not worn in months. It felt unnecessary, uncomfortable even. There was nowhere to go, no one to see. And yet, as I stood there adjusting the cuffs of my shirt, I noticed something subtle but undeniable. I felt present. Not happy, not fulfilled, but present in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. As if I had stepped back into my own life, instead of observing it from a distance. It was a small shift, almost invisible, but it was real. And that's where it began. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting a sleeve that didn't need adjusting, as if the act itself might confirm something had changed. It hadn't, not in any dramatic way. The house was still quiet. The clock was still ticking with the same stubborn rhythm. Eleanor was still gone. But there was a faint sense, difficult to describe, that I had re-entered my own life, instead of waiting outside of it. That morning, I made breakfast. Now that may not sound remarkable, but for nearly a year, breakfast had been something I assembled, not prepared. Toast eaten standing up, a banana sometimes, coffee that went cold because I forgot I had poured it. Food had become functional, a way to keep the body moving without asking anything from the day. Cooking, real cooking, had disappeared along with the person I used to cook for. I opened the refrigerator and found eggs, a tomato, half an onion. Ingredients, not a meal. For a moment I almost closed the door and returned to the familiar routine of doing as little as possible. Effort can feel unreasonable when no one is there to witness it. But I remembered the decision. One thing differently. So I cooked. Not well, not with any particular enthusiasm, but deliberately. I chopped the onions slowly, noticing the way the knife sounded against the cutting board. I cracked the eggs into a bowl, instead of directly into the pan. Something Eleanor had always insisted made a difference. I don't know if it does, but I did it anyway. Small acts of care, even when no one is watching, have a way of reminding you that you are still someone worth caring for. I set the table. That was harder than the cooking. A plate, a fork, a glass. Simple objects, but arranged with intention, they carried a kind of weight I wasn't prepared for. For months I had avoided the table. It felt too large, too quiet, too honest. Eating at the counter had been easier. Less like an acknowledgement of absence. But I sat down. The first few bites were uncomfortable, not because of the food, but because of the awareness. I was alone. Fully, undeniably alone at that table. There was no conversation to fill the space, no shared glance, no small interruption. Just the sound of a fork against a plate, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. And yet, I stayed. Halfway through the meal, something shifted again. Not happiness, not even contentment, just a softening of resistance. I wasn't trying to escape the moment anymore. I was in it. And strangely, that felt better than avoiding it. After breakfast, I didn't turn on the television. That was new. The silence returned, but it felt slightly different this time. Less like an enemy, more like a space I hadn't yet learned how to use. I walked through the house not with purpose, but with attention. The living room, the hallway, the small bedroom at the back that still held boxes I hadn't opened since Eleanor passed. There is a difference between living in a space and moving through it. For a long time, I had been doing the latter, passing from room to room without really seeing any of it. That morning I noticed things. Dust on the bookshelf, a photograph slightly tilted, a chair positioned just a few inches off from where it used to sit. These were not important details, but they were mine, evidence that I was still here, still part of this environment, still capable of shaping it. I picked up the photograph. It was from a summer trip we took years ago. Eleanor standing near the water, squinting into the sun, her hand raised as if to block the light or wave me away from taking the picture. I had seen that photograph countless times, but that morning it felt different. Not like a reminder of loss, but like a record of something that had been real. Grief, I realized, had been flattening everything into absence. But memory, if you let it, can return shape to what you've lost. I placed the photograph back, but straighter this time. That became the second thing. Noticing and then adjusting. It sounds small, and it is. But small actions have a way of accumulating into something larger when repeated with intention. I straightened the chair. I wiped the dust from the shelf. I opened the curtains in a room I hadn't used in months and let the light in, even though there was no one to appreciate it but me. Especially because there was no one else. There's an assumption people make, often without realizing it, that effort only matters when it's seen, that care requires an audience. But that morning, moving slowly through those rooms, I began to understand something I wish I had known earlier in life. The way you treat your environment is the way you treat yourself. If you move through your home as if it doesn't matter, you begin to feel like you don't matter either. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, in the same quiet way loneliness arrives. By midday, I was tired. Not the heavy, empty tiredness I had grown used to, but a different kind. The kind that follows activity, however small. I sat down in the living room, the television still off, and for a moment, I considered turning it on out of habit. The silence pressed in again, familiar, persistent. But I didn't reach for the remote. Instead, I listened. To the clock, to the faint sound of a car passing outside, to my own breathing, steady and present. It wasn't peaceful exactly. Peace suggests comfort, and I wasn't comfortable yet. But it was real, and real, I was beginning to understand, is where everything starts. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I stepped outside. Not for a reason, not to go anywhere specific, just to stand on the front step and feel the air. It was cooler than I expected, with a slight breeze that carried the smell of something I couldn't quite place. For a moment, I simply stood there, uncertain of what came next. When you've been inside your own life for too long, even a small step outward can feel unfamiliar. So I walked. Not far, just to the end of the path and back again. My knees reminded me of their age almost immediately, a quiet protest with each step. I considered turning around early, returning to the safety of the familiar, but I kept going, slowly, deliberately, as if distance mattered less than the act itself. At the edge of the property, I stopped. There was nothing remarkable there, just the street, a few houses, a tree that had likely been there longer than I had. But standing there, I felt something I hadn't expected. Connection. Not to a person, not to a conversation, but to the world itself. The simple fact that I was still part of it, still able to step outside, to move, to see, to exist beyond the walls I had been living within. It was brief, fleeting, but it was enough, because it suggested something important. Maybe happiness wasn't something that required other people to begin. Maybe it started with something much smaller. The next morning, the clock sounded the same. That might seem like a small thing to notice, but when you're trying to change your life, you begin to look for signs that something, anything, will feel different. That the air will shift, or your thoughts will rearrange themselves into something clearer, something easier to carry. But the truth is, most mornings arrive exactly as the last one did, quiet, familiar, unremarkable. The difference, I was beginning to understand, was not in the morning. It was in me. I got dressed again, properly, not because I felt like it, but because I had done it the day before, and something in me wanted to see what would happen if I did it again. There's a quiet power in repetition, not the kind that excites you, but the kind that steadies you. That was the third thing I learned. You don't wait to feel different before you act. You act, and then slowly the feeling follows. After dressing, I stood in the kitchen for a moment, unsure of what came next. The previous day had been an experiment. This day felt like a continuation, though I wasn't entirely certain of what I was continuing. So I returned to something simple. I made coffee. But this time, I didn't rush it. I didn't treat it as a step to get through on the way to something else. I stood there, watching the steam rise, listening to the quiet sounds of the kettle, noticing the way the light from the window caught the surface of the cup. When you've spent a long time feeling disconnected, attention becomes a kind of bridge. I carried the coffee to the chair by the window. Not Eleanor's chair. Mine. I had avoided it in a way, because it faced the street, and the street reminded me of movement, of life continuing elsewhere. But that morning, I sat down and looked out. A man walked past with a dog. I had seen them before, though I had never paid much attention. The dog pulled slightly at the leash, eager, curious. The man followed at a slower pace, steady, practiced. They disappeared around the corner within seconds. It wasn't an important moment, and yet it stayed with me. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't just observing life as something separate from me. I was witnessing it as something I was still part of, even in a small, quiet way. That led to the fourth thing. Routine is not a prison. It's a structure you can build meaning inside of. For a long time, my days had no shape. They stretched out, unstructured, indistinct. 1 hour blended into the next, until the entire day felt like a single, uninterrupted stretch of time. And when time loses its structure, it becomes difficult to feel anything within it. So I began to create small anchors. Morning, get dressed, make coffee, sit by the window. Midday, prepare a meal, not assemble one. Afternoon, step outside, even if only for a few minutes. Evening, sit at the table, not the counter. These were not goals. They were not achievements. They were simply points in the day where I chose to show up. At first, it felt forced, artificial even, as if I were pretending to have a life rather than actually living one. But over time, something shifted. The structure began to hold. And inside that structure, something unexpected started to grow. A sense of continuity. The days no longer felt like isolated events. They began to connect, one to the next, forming something that resembled a life again. Not the life I had before, not the one I had lost, but something new. Smaller, quieter, but still real. One afternoon, about a week into this quiet experiment, I noticed the plant on the windowsill. It had been there for years. Eleanor had cared for it, watering it regularly, turning it slightly so each side would receive sunlight. After she passed, I had continued to water it out of habit, but without much attention. It had survived, though not particularly well. The leaves were dull, a little dry at the edges. I stood there looking at it, and I realized I hadn't really seen it in months. So I did something simple. I moved it, just a few inches closer to the light. Then I trimmed one of the dry leaves, not carefully, not with any particular skill, but with intention. It felt oddly significant, though I couldn't have explained why. Over the next few days, I paid attention to it. I noticed when the soil was dry. I adjusted its position slightly. I wiped dust from the leaves with a cloth. Small acts barely worth mentioning, and yet they created a connection. Not a dramatic one, not the kind people write about, but a quiet awareness that something was responding, however subtly, to my care. And that's when it became clear. The fifth thing, happiness, especially when you're alone, does not come from being entertained. It comes from being engaged. There's a difference. Entertainment fills time. Engagement gives it shape. For a long time, I had been trying to fill my days, to make them pass more comfortably. Television, idle routines, waiting. But filling time is not the same as living it. It's a way of avoiding it. Engagement, on the other hand, requires participation, attention, a willingness to be involved, even in small, seemingly insignificant ways. The plant didn't transform my life, but caring for it changed something in me. It reminded me that I was still capable of influence, that my actions, however small, still had an effect on the world around me. And that feeling, that sense of quiet agency, is closer to happiness than most people realize. Later that same week, I found myself in the kitchen again, preparing dinner, not out of obligation, not even out of routine, but because I wanted to. That surprised me. Desire had been absent for a long time, not just for food, but for most things. Days had been something to move through, not something to participate in. But there I was, choosing to cook, not because I had to, but because it felt like something worth doing. I chopped vegetables with more attention than necessary. I let the food cook a little longer, just to see how it would turn out. I set the table again, the same way I had before, but this time with less hesitation. When I sat down to eat, the silence was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy, because it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with something I had created. That's the part no one tells you. When you're alone, the meaning doesn't arrive from outside. It doesn't come knocking on the door or calling on the phone. It has to be built, slowly, deliberately, out of small actions that don't seem important at first. And the more you build, the more there is to feel. I won't pretend that everything changed. There were still long evenings, still moments where the quiet stretched too far, still days where I felt the absence of what I had lost so clearly it was almost physical. But those moments no longer defined everything. They became part of a larger experience, one that included effort, attention, and something I hadn't expected to find again, a sense that my life, even now, was still something I could shape. It was around that time I began to notice something I had been avoiding for years, my own thoughts. Not the passing kind, not the ones that come and go without leaving much behind, but the quieter ones that sit just beneath the surface, waiting for space. When your life is full, those thoughts rarely get the chance to speak. There's always something louder: conversation, responsibility, movement. But when you're alone, truly alone, they rise. And for a long time, I had done everything I could to keep them quiet. The television, the routine of doing nothing, the small distractions that filled the hours, they weren't just habits. They were shields. Because sitting alone with your thoughts, especially after loss, can feel like opening a door you're not sure you can close again. But something had shifted. Not courage exactly, more like a willingness to stop running. One evening I turned off the lights earlier than usual, not to go to sleep, but to sit in the dim quiet of the living room. The only light came from a lamp in the corner, soft and steady. I sat in my chair, hands resting in my lap, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't reach for anything to fill the silence. I let it be. At first, it was uncomfortable. My mind moved quickly, almost restlessly, jumping from one thought to another. Memories surfaced without invitation. Eleanor in the kitchen, the sound of laughter from years ago, conversations I could no longer finish because the other voice was gone. And then, beneath all of that, something heavier: regret. Not sharp or overwhelming, but persistent. The kind that lingers in the background of your life, becoming clearer when everything else grows quiet. Things I hadn't said. Time I had assumed would always be there. Small moments I had rushed through, not realizing they would one day become the ones I wished I could return to. I almost stood up, almost turned the television back on, but I didn't, because I was beginning to understand something important. Avoiding those thoughts hadn't made them disappear. It had only delayed them. And sitting there, in that quiet room, I realized that maybe they weren't there to hurt me. Maybe they were there to be understood. That was the hardest lesson. The sixth, if I were to count it. You have to allow yourself to feel everything, not just the parts that are easy to carry. Grief doesn't end because time passes. It changes shape. It softens in some places, deepens in others. And if you don't allow yourself to experience it fully, it doesn't leave. It settles. It becomes part of the silence you're trying to escape. So I sat there longer than I wanted to. I let the memories come. Some were warm, others were not. But all of them were mine. Evidence of a life that had been full, complicated, imperfect. A life that didn't disappear just because the people in it had. And slowly something unexpected happened. The weight shifted. Not gone, not resolved, but different. Less like something pressing down on me, more like something I could carry. There's a difference, a subtle one, but it matters. Because when you can carry something, you can move with it. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had stopped resisting what was already there. The next day, I did something I hadn't planned. I spoke out loud. It wasn't a conversation. There was no one there to respond. But as I moved through the house, I found myself saying small things, observations, thoughts, even a quiet comment about the weather as I looked out the window. At first, it felt strange. Then it felt normal. We think of connection as something that only exists between people. And yes, that is a part of it, a significant part. But there is another kind of connection, one that is often overlooked: the relationship you have with yourself. For a long time, I had treated my own presence as something secondary, something that only mattered in relation to others. But alone in that house, I began to see that I was still someone worth speaking to, worth listening to. So I continued, not constantly, not in a way that would seem unusual to anyone passing by, but in small, quiet moments. A sentence here, a thought there. It wasn't about filling the silence. It was about acknowledging that I was still here within it. And that led to something else, a kind of companionship I hadn't expected. Not a replacement for the people I had lost. Nothing could be that. But a steady, reliable presence that didn't depend on anyone else's schedule, or availability, or willingness. My own. That realization didn't solve everything. There were still moments, especially in the evenings, where the absence of another person felt sharp and immediate. Times when I wished for a voice that wasn't my own, for a presence that didn't have to be imagined. I won't pretend those moments disappeared. They didn't. But they changed, because they were no longer the only thing I felt. There was something alongside them now, a quiet stability, a sense that even in the absence of others, I was not entirely alone. That may sound like a small distinction, but it changes everything. As the days passed, these small practices, dressing, cooking, walking, noticing, allowing, speaking, began to weave together, not into something dramatic, not into a life that would look impressive from the outside, but into something that felt steady from within. And that's when I understood what I had been getting wrong all along. Happiness is not something that replaces loneliness. It's something that exists beside it. Waiting for loneliness to disappear before allowing yourself to feel anything else is like waiting for the ocean to become still before you step into it. It doesn't work that way. You step in as it is. You learn to stand, even as it moves around you. And over time, you realize you're no longer being pulled under. You're simply there. Living. Not the way you once did. Not the way you expected to. But in a way that is still valid. Still meaningful. Still yours. I used to think that a life without friends, without constant company, was a life diminished. Now I'm not so sure. Because what I found in this quiet, in this space I once feared, is something I never made time for before. Attention. Presence. A kind of honesty with myself that only seems to emerge when there's nothing else to hide behind. If someone had told me years ago that this is where I would end up, I might have felt sorry for myself in advance. I might have imagined a life reduced to silence and routine. But that's not what this is. Not anymore. It's something quieter, yes, but also something deeper. And in that depth, there is a kind of happiness that doesn't depend on who is or isn't in the room, a kind that stays. There is one more thing I need to tell you. It's not as simple as getting dressed, or cooking a meal, or walking to the end of the street. Those things matter, more than they seem to. But they are not the whole of it. They are the beginning, the structure, the way you steady yourself long enough to see clearly. What comes after is quieter, and in some ways, harder, because it asks something you may have spent a lifetime avoiding. It asks you to choose. Not once, not in a grand decisive moment, but over and over again, in ways so small they almost feel invisible. To choose to participate in your own life, even when no one is watching, even when no one is asking you to, even when it would be easier not to. A few days ago, I stood in my kitchen, holding a loaf of bread I had just taken out of the oven. It wasn't perfect, a little uneven on one side, slightly darker on the bottom than I intended. Eleanor would have noticed that immediately. She had an eye for those things. I almost smiled thinking about it. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I cut 2 slices. Not one. I placed them on plates and set them on the table across from each other. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at them. It would have been easy to put one back, to tell myself there was no reason for the second plate. But I left it, not as an act of denial, not as a way of pretending something hadn't changed, but as a quiet acknowledgement that my life had included love, that it still shaped the way I moved through the world, that absence does not erase what was real. I sat down and ate my portion slowly. The other plate remained untouched. After a while, I stood, carried it back to the kitchen, and wrapped the bread for later. There was no sadness in that moment, just a kind of understanding that some things stay with you, not as wounds, but as part of your structure, and that you can carry them without breaking. This is what I wish someone had told me earlier. Being alone is not the end of your life. It is a different shape of it, one that requires more intention, more awareness, more honesty, but also one that offers something in return, if you're willing to meet it where it is. Space, to notice, to choose, to build something small and real, piece by piece, day by day. You may still have moments where the silence feels too loud. I do. You may still reach for someone who isn't there. I have. You may still wonder from time to time how things became what they are. That doesn't go away completely, but it no longer has to define everything, because alongside it, there can be something else. A morning where you dress with care, not for anyone else, but because you are still here. A meal prepared with attention, even if you are the only one who will taste it. A short walk that reminds you the world has not closed its doors to you. A quiet room that no longer feels like something you need to escape. And perhaps most importantly, a growing sense that your presence in your own life matters. Not because someone else confirms it, but because you do. I don't have a large circle of friends. I don't fill my days with constant activity. Most evenings the house is still as quiet as it was before, but it is no longer empty in the way it once felt. Fully. Not waiting. Not avoiding. Not disappearing. Just living, in a way that is smaller than before, yes, but also clearer, and strangely, more complete. If you are where I was, sitting in a quiet room, wondering how it became so quiet, wondering what you are supposed to do with all this time and no one to share it with, start small. Not because small is all you're capable of, but because small is what works. Put on real clothes, make real food, step outside, notice something, care for something, let yourself feel what you feel without trying to fix it too quickly, and then do it again the next day. Not perfectly, just consistently. Because happiness, the kind that lasts, the kind that doesn't depend on who stays or who leaves, is not something you find all at once. It's something you build, quietly, patiently, in the same space where you once felt the most alone. I'm 87 years old. I have lost people I thought I could not live without. I have sat in rooms so quiet I could hear my own thoughts echo, and I am telling you now, as plainly as I can, you are still allowed to have a life. Not the one you had, not the one you expected, but one that is still yours. And that is enough.